Good morning. Well, we're so honored that National Geographic has chosen the U as its inaugural institution for its on-campus program, and we're thrilled to see so many students here. So the focus of this panel is Florida in 2100. We want to consider what kind of future you're inheriting here in the state of Florida, but more importantly, what you can do to ensure its sustainability. Now, we all know that climate change and sea level rise are some of the most vexing issues facing us here in Florida. We also know, for example, that it's estimated that by the end of the century, Florida will lose over 1 million homes as a result of sea level rise, the largest number in the nation. But of course, we care about more than just real estate. We care about the very existential future of the Florida Peninsula. And we also care about the extent to which nature conservation and human habitation can coexist in shaping our future. So today's presenters are going to take us on a Florida journey through air and sea, in fresh and salt water, and across the landscape in between. They're going to show us the ways in which science and storytelling can raise awareness about environmental issues. And they'll also share with us the incredible work that each one of them is doing in order to promote conservation and sustainability to ensure that we indeed do have a Florida in 2100. So it's my pleasure to now introduce our speakers. Carlton Ward Jr. is an 8th-generation Floridian and National Geographic explorer who uses photography to inspire conservation of his home state's nature and culture. Captain Barrington Irving has a passion to explore, inspire, and educate others. He's traveled to 50 countries, and in 2007 set 2 world records at the age of 23 as the youngest person and first Black pilot to fly solo around the world. Rachel Silverstein is the executive director of Miami Waterkeeper. In that position, she works to ensure that Miami's water is drinkable, swimmable, and fishable. And the speaker who will kick off our conversation this morning is Jenny Adler, a conservation photographer, cave diver, and National Geographic explorer. Her work as a photographer is informed by her scientific background. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Jenny Adler for our first presentation today.
Thank you. Every day in Florida, we withdraw 2.4 billion gallons from the aquifer. About 50% of the people in the United States get their drinking water from groundwater, but here in Florida, more than 92% of us get our water from beneath our feet. But because it's hidden beneath our feet, very few of us really have the chance to connect with it, and the concept of an aquifer really tends to be abstract and maybe kind of confusing. As a cave diver, I've experienced the winding passageways of the aquifer, and this is what it looks like. And I want to try to share this with as many people as possible. Thankfully, here in Florida, at the surface, more than 1,000 freshwater springs appear. And these springs are direct connections to the underlying aquifer. But really, we all too often see this water as a resource rather than an ecosystem. And we're more likely to see water coming out of a tap than really maybe connecting with it, coming out of a spring or flowing down a river. So a key point moving forward towards 2100 as our population continues to grow will be connection. Because our actions and how we relate to our water and how we use water does matter. Every 5 years, the U.S. Geological Survey collects and compiles water use data from around the country, and they just released the data from 2015. So what it showed in 2015 was that public supply was the largest user of water, overtaking agriculture for the first time since data was compiled in 1965. So you can see that since 2000, when water use really peaked, we have reduced our consumption. But because our population is growing, even if we each use the same amount, we are going to continue to increase the amount of water that we use. But the issue is also that our decisions about how we use water are important not only for ourselves and for our springs, but for the other organisms and ecosystems that also rely on this fresh water. A lot of times our decisions about fresh water take into account what we may need in the future, but they don't always take into account what these ecosystems require. So I'm originally a scientist by training, but now I really use this background to inform my imagery and help scientists communicate their work and really help people connect to ecosystems that may lie just out of sight. For the past 7 years, I have focused my lens on Florida's freshwater and telling the story of this water. And as part of my research for my PhD, I really dug into actually the communications research and found that it tells over and over that facts and information do not change people's minds, but that communicating through narrative and storytelling can have this power. So pretty photos can really help connect people with a place, so people can look at something like this and maybe be inspired to visit nature and protect it, maybe be inspired to be more connected with their water. But if we're going to show photos like this, we also have to show this, or else we're really leaving out a crucial part of the narrative. These two photos were taken in the exact same location in Gilchrist Blue Spring, exactly 1 year apart. So this is January 2017 and January 2018. This is another location in the same spring in January 2017, and exactly 1 year later in January 2018. Many springs have transitioned to an algal-dominated state, and this is a complex ecological problem. A lot of times in media coverage, we tend to cover these problems with a very simple, where we blame it on one thing, and then because we are really searching for a simple solution to this problem. But with ecology, it's never simple, it's always complex. So what we can't see from these photos, the reason for this increase in algae, something that's not particularly usually looked at in the scientific literature, and it's that this happened. Hurricane Irma. It submerged everything and completely blocked photosynthesis for about 10 days and killed all of the plants. So what I really think moving forward into 2100 is when we tell stories, we need to really tell stories that are true to the complexity of the science and show our springs and rivers as important ecosystems. So one story I've been working on is about freshwater turtles, and there are 14 native species of freshwater turtles in the Santa Fe River Basin. That's the same number as in the Amazon River Basin, which is 2,000 times the size. So just 6 hours north of here, just north of Gainesville, Florida, where I live, is this incredible turtle biodiversity hotspot, and we need to really show these ecosystems as incredible places that we need to preserve and connect as we continue to use this same water. Photos can also be used to communicate complex scientific research. This is a hydrological study that looks at how water moves and mixes as it emerges from Silver Spring in Central Florida and Ocala. And this is something, talking to the researcher, that you can talk to him for an hour and still not quite get what he does. But I've read the abstract so many times, it's so confusing. But looking at this photo can really engage people and help people see that science is beautiful no matter how complex it is, and connect them to science in a new way. As I started delving more into the literature on water and communicating science, I began to wonder how we could really inspire the next generation to connect with their fresh water. We need to give them the voice and the ability to experience and explore their fresh water and help them be part of the story. We don't just want to tell stories, we want to engage people in them and give them a voice. So during work on my PhD, I found 2 pages in a 5th grade science textbook that talked about water, 2 pages. And I read the standards, and there's one standard in 5th grade that says that students need to learn about the water cycle, but there's nothing in there that specifically says that they need to learn about the springs and the aquifer. So the very water that we live our lives on is not in these statewide standards. So I began to rethink how we could teach kids about water. And so I started the Walking on Water program, and this program puts cameras in the hands of kids and puts them in our water, immerses them in the springs, and helps them form a connection with this drinking water. Kids experience the springs firsthand in this program and build their own stories about it. And after they go out to the springs, I created an exhibit with their photos in it, and they could go see and experience and share their stories with the community. And what came of this is I did an official pre and post evaluation of it using qualitative and quantitative methods. And I was not trained in qualitative research, but the answers that I got from the students on the qualitative responses were incredibly rich and gave a lot of meaning to the qualitative things that I measured in the study. And it was a really cool learning experience to delve into that new type of research. And what I found was that students started to see the water through the lens of their camera as more of an ecosystem rather than as a resource. So it's something that they should protect, not just because it's their drinking water, but because it's home to these really unique places and unique creatures. And you can see them here swimming behind the snake. And that cloud is from 2 boys that were chasing the snake. And ironically, they stopped when they got to the vegetation because it freaked them out. So apparently snakes are okay and plants are not. But I wanted to think of a way, after bringing the kids to the water, to bring them into the caves, which is obviously not possible, and I would get in a lot of trouble. So as a cave diver, I was like, how can I bring you with me? And so this is me shooting images in an aptly named spring called Devil's Ear, which is the entrance to the Devil's Cave system at Jenny Springs. So if any of you have ever tubed down the Santa Fe River, there's more than 6 miles of mapped underground cave passageway with only 2 entrances to it right next to each other. And you can see here the dark tannic water from the Santa Fe River swirling with the clear spring water coming out. And what you can't see from this picture is that there's so much flow coming from below that my legs are wrapped around a log and the tripod is tied to the log with the cave diving line. Because the camera can't move as I'm taking these pictures because I'm stitching together 360 image, the first 360 virtual tour of the Floridan aquifer. And now anyone can go online if you Google Walking on Water Florida, and you can swim through the aquifer in a virtual tour as if you're there on a cave dive with me. So the goal of this is to bring the aquifer above ground so that people can see and connect with this water that supports our life here in Florida. And you can see a diver here for scale on the left, and then on the right is a little white sign that we call the Grim Reaper sign that basically says, stop, prevent your death, go no further. But in this virtual tour, you can swim past that sign and see what lies beyond there. So in Florida, these springs are lenses into the water beneath our feet, and scientific research tells us, like I've mentioned, that these issues are complex. But this complexity should not lead to confusion moving forward, because our problems are not going to get any less complex as our population continues to grow into 2100. Instead, these solutions to our water issues need to be multifaceted, and I argue that they also need to be creative, engaging people in thought, conversation, and action. Each and every Floridian, each and every one of you sitting in this room, even if you don't live in Florida full-time, if you're at the University of Miami, you are each part of water's story. And while we are all part of the problem, we all need to also be part of the solutions. And I challenge you to go do that. Thank you. I'd now like to welcome Rachel Silverstein to the stage.
Great job, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. I'm feeling inspired already. What cool work is being done. I love it. So today for the panel on Florida 2100, I want this to actually be a look into our past and to actually check out Florida, what it looked like 100 years ago, to understand where we're going to be 100 years from now. These are all images I'm going to show you from something called the Florida Memory Project. And you can actually go online and put in a keyword and see some really cool images from Florida's past. Does anyone recognize this? You've probably all been there. Miami Beach. Specifically, this is the creation of Lincoln Road. You can imagine the Rosa Mexicana right there. How about this? This is actually Bayshore Drive in Coconut Grove. And everything to the east of this rock ridge here in Coconut Grove is fill, and actually used to be Biscayne Bay. So people are here sailing down Bayshore Drive. So the history of Florida, I think, is really, and Jenny gave us a great background on this, is really about water and about changing our water and engineering our water. And this is an image of what historical water flow used to be like in South Florida. The water would flow over Lake Okeechobee, feed the Everglades, recharge the aquifers that Jenny was showing you pictures of, and flow down into Biscayne Bay and Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. There was a long effort to always be changing this, but we used to have so much fresh water here in Miami that it used to bubble up through the bottom of Biscayne Bay, And people are shown here refilling their drinking water supplies in the middle of Biscayne Bay because the water was so fresh. They said pirates used to stop here in order to refill their supplies for their sailing. This is actually the Miami River. There were rapids along the Miami River, which is hard to imagine now if anyone's seen the river lately. But so much fresh water flowing into this area. But already by 1909, we were starting to change the water patterns. There was always this idea that we could change Florida, that we could drain the Everglades, and that the land underneath the Everglades would provide a winter garden for the rest of the country, and that would be really fertile land under that water area. So dredging was starting. This is 1919. In downtown Miami, we're already starting to build seawalls and to change how the people on land were interacting with our waterways and our bodies of water. And by the 1940s, we had very significant water control structures that was preventing that freshwater flow from Lake Okeechobee from reaching these areas. And instead of having a lot of freshwater flow to this region, we now have these artificial channels that you probably see all through your daily life in and around Miami. And these are artificial structures built to control the flow of water. We now have very pulsed, very engineered water flow in this region in Florida, and that's resulted in much less fresh water coming into the region. We don't see people filling up their fresh water and drinking the water in Biscayne Bay anymore because it's basically almost the same salinity as seawater much of the time. This is another one of my favorite studies that was done by a scientist named Lauren McClanahan, and this is her 2009 study. And it's this field of historical ecology. And it's going back and finding unusual data sets to try to piece together what the environment used to look like before there were really good records. So looking at sailors' journals or antique artifacts that use shark teeth, for example. And this study looked at the Monroe County Library and records of photographs taken by charter boat fishermen every day in the same little post. They would hang up their largest catch since the 1950s. So she went through this whole data set since the 1950s and looked at what kind of fish were present and how large those fish were and how many were being caught. You can see here a lot of Goliath grouper, these really enormous fish, a high volume of them. That was 1957. Now we're looking at 1958. Again, a lot of these Goliath grouper present. Shifting forward now to the 1960s, you see some Goliath grouper, but the species composition is beginning to change. The abundance is starting to decrease. They're catching different types of fish and less of them. Oops. I skipped the 1980s, which has some of the best wardrobe. There we go. Thank you. So the 1980s, you see those groupers basically completely gone. You see some hogfish. There's still a lot of fish being caught, but they're different sizes, they're different species, they're different makeups. And this is 2007. And by 2007, there's a few snappers and a small shark being caught. But this, I think, represents really beautifully a concept of ecology known as shifting baselines. And that is that you might come to Florida and go fishing and catch these fish and think you had an amazing day on the water and you're really enjoying yourself and you caught all these fish. But without knowing what that experience used to be like or what the condition of that ecosystem was, you wouldn't have an appreciation for what might be lost and what might be missing from the ecosystem today. So putting together these historical data sets is really interesting and really important. And as we view our landscape today, it's important to keep in mind where we came from. So moving ahead from 2000s, we're in the 2000s, and there was a real effort, not just in the 1970s for an environmental movement, but now we're really looking at what can we do to put this ecosystem back together. And this was the start of the Great Everglades Restoration Project that's still going on now, that's still in progress. It's cost many billions of dollars just trying to put that water flow back together. And now here we are today with Miami, one of the locations in the world with the most resources at risk from sea level rise and flooding. This is a result of climate change, of water expanding, of ice caps melting, and we are actually seeing a measurable increase in sea level in Miami, and that is causing things like this, which is that it hasn't rained, but we are having water in our streets because our critical infrastructure is not working anymore and not working on a gravity-based system. So looking forward now into the future, not quite to 2100 yet, but to the year 2040. This is the Turkey Point nuclear power plant located on the southern end of Biscayne Bay. This is the University of Florida sea level rise viewer. If we look at the best case scenario for projections for 2040, from the Army Corps of Engineers, lowest end of their projection curve, what does this region look like? Well, we see flooding here 365 days a year at that power plant, and that is in 22 years from now. It takes over 20 years to decommission a power plant. It takes over 20 years to bring a new power plant online. So what is the plan, and what are we going to do about the flooding of this critical infrastructure? Now let's skip ahead to 2100. Lowest end of the projection curve. What does Miami look like? Well, we still see the area around Turkey Point flooded. We see some of the Everglades areas flooded, but it's not as bad as the high end of the projection curve for Miami in 2100 if we continue on the same path and we don't address this issue head on. We have massive multi-system failures of critical infrastructure like wastewater, like drinking water in our aquifer, and power. But this is still a long way off. We still have a choice of what our future is going to look like. And that is, I think, the really good news. And we can choose a future with coral reefs or without coral reefs. We can choose a future that looks like this or like this. This is a tributary of the Miami River. The good news is also that we know what's causing these problems, and now we just have to fix it. And I'll tell you what we're doing at Miami Waterkeeper to address these issues. We're educating the next generation of environmental leaders. This is one of our junior ambassadors who is part of our program, and she's giving a public comment to the Coral Gables City Commission. We're training students to interact with government, to know how to make change, to learn about these issues. We're talking to the media. We do scientific research to aid conservation. We're sampling the water to let you know if it is safe for you to swim in your local bodies of water, and we're taking action if it isn't. You can actually, before you go to the beach, check out our app called Swim Guide, and it'll tell you the latest water quality testing information so that you know, and you can be empowered with that information to go to the beach or not and to make change or not. And I'll tell you, this summer we had 8 beaches closed at once for high bacteria levels. We're talking to our local elected officials. And we will actually bring people to court if they are breaking environmental laws. So the good news here is also that all of you are here today. And in this room, we have people who are exceptionally educated, exceptionally talented, exceptionally interested. There are artists, lawyers, engineers, inventors, coders, explorers, who are going to make sure that the scenario that we're looking at is the best possible outcome. That we have reefs, that we have a beautiful environment, and that we still have a Florida that has a lot of our most special and beautiful natural resources. So it is really up to all of you, and I have complete confidence that all of you are going to be here to make sure that our future is bright, and Florida 2100 is a wonderful place to be. Thank you. And please now welcome Barrington Irving to the stage.
All right, guys, afternoon. I'm pretty excited about being here and talking about Florida in 2100. I'm actually native to Florida. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, moved to Miami, Florida at the age of 6. That's my elementary school picture there. I played for a football team that was ranked #1, not only in the state of Florida, but in the entire country, Miami Northwestern Senior High School. And I thought football would have been my path. Oh, we got some Bulls in the audience here, right? So, I thought football would have been my path until one day I had a chance interaction with an airline pilot who shared with me how much money he made professionally. And I took an interest into aviation, and interest turned into passion, and next thing you know, I went on to set a Guinness World Record in 2007. I took the record from 37 down to age 23, where I became the youngest person ever and the first black man to fly solo around the world. So when we think about Florida in 2100, this topic actually hit me pretty hard, right? And I thought about what exactly would I want to touch on. And I thought about it some more, and I said to myself, I got it. Something that impacts all of us, every single person in this room, something that I hate tremendously, and it's traffic. What exactly do I mean? Urbanization is increasing, right? By 2050, the absolute urban population will almost double. 70% of the global population will live in urban areas. The average ride-sharing service, the average trip for a ride-sharing service is 5 to 7 miles. Right? So yes, it's productive, it saves us in time, but also it creates more congestion. By 2050, world population will near 10 billion and 11.2 billion by 2100. Now, I have to adjust my life around this. My planes are located at Opa-locka Airport. I moved from a different part of Miami, Miami to Miami Lakes, so that way I can be within 10 minutes of the airport, jump in my airplane and go. I don't have time for traffic. And when we think about what this actually costs us in the quality of our life, right? The annual cost of congestion in the United States, $305 billion in 2017. An average of almost $1,500 we waste per driver based on traffic. Drivers spend 125 hours in congestion in LA. It's the third leading cause of people going to the hospital, right, for medical injuries. Now, let's look at Florida itself. You guys are familiar with this part of I-95, right? Miamians spend 105 hours a year in traffic. We have the 5th worst in the nation. That's worse than DC. Floridians Google, this was a trip. Floridians Google speeding ticket and traffic tickets more than any other state. They also have the 2nd lowest number of insured drivers in the nation. Miami is ranked 14th most congested city in the world. So as a state, how are we going to deal with this? And I thought about it, and I started to look at technology. I know when we consider changes as relates to Florida in 2100, we think about the environment, but also, what about technology? And this is where we're heading, guys. This stuff exists today. What you're looking at here is electrical vertical takeoff and land aircrafts. We call them eVTOLs. It's going to change the way urban cities operate as it relates to transportation. These vehicles will travel 500 feet above ground roughly, cover a range of 30 to 60 nautical miles. Remember how long I said the average ride-sharing service trip was? 5 to 7 miles. Right? Instead of airports, you will depart from vertiports. Urban air mobility has the potential to radically reshape how transportation is conducted. Industries of growth, electrical propulsion, autonomous flight, shared on-demand flights. Now, I know you guys are looking at me saying, well, what will this tangibly look like in the real world? Well, I actually have a video of that, and this is done by Uber. Guys, this is not 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I can't share a lot of information because of some things that I'm doing, but this exists right now. That aircraft has already been built. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, well, how does this affect air traffic congestion? Great question. Here's a video clip of air travel. Oh, I'll go back. They might have to manually play it. Here we go. This is air traffic across the United States in a 24-hour cycle. But although planes take off and land, remember the space I mentioned in which these airplanes will operate, within 500 feet above ground. Most commercial airliners, their typical cruising altitude is between 27,000 to 35,000, 37,000 feet. There's also initiatives being made around next generation, right? They have this next generation technology that's being utilized by air traffic controllers and airplanes where you can increase the boundaries in which an airplane can fly, right? They can fly much closer within a proximity to get to the same location. So technology is also changing the way we utilize airspace as well. Another thing you guys should keep in mind as it relates to Florida is there's going to be the creation of spaceports. This also exists presently right now. The average ticket to travel to space will be about $200,000. And eventually it will work itself down. But Florida is going to be positioned in a unique opportunity to take advantage of that. Now, what about the workforce? We do projects with students where we build airplanes from scratch, we build race cars, hovercrafts, we build all these crazy equipment with students. And we're finding more and more what's happening in the state of Florida is we're going to need multi-skilled technicians. A lot of fields and industries are overlapping in the type of talent in which they're trying to recruit. So as we think about Florida in 2100, yes, there will be changes to the environment, but technology is also going to shape the way in which we function. Get ready because it already exists now. Thank you guys so much for that film. And now I'd like to introduce Carlton Ward Jr.
Thank you. Well, that was awesome, and I'm looking forward to the type of photography we can do from those kind of aircrafts. Thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to be here and share some of my experiences from the times I've spent exploring wild Florida and some ideas of how to balance this state going forward. Our state is really many different worlds, but I'm going to talk about two of them. And it's this world we see every day from the coast, and it's this world that's hidden in plain sight in the interior. Florida has a lot of challenges, and this is one of them. It's a very popular place to be, and we get about 1,000 people a day moving here, net. That translates on our current development patterns to about 100,000 acres every single year being converted out of natural land use into developed land use. And so projecting that forward, we have some real challenges. We also have opportunities, and the opportunity lies in the still rural makeup of interior Florida. We have vast agricultural lands, cattle ranches, areas that help tie together a green infrastructure that can continue to supply the water and the needs for the people along the coast. My focus for the past dozen years or so has been trying to raise awareness for this interior Florida. And I came at it from an ecological perspective, thinking about 5 to 6 million acres of cattle ranch that people don't necessarily identify with Florida, but are also mostly in the crosshairs for development. In 50 years from now, much of this land could be gone if we don't change course. I also come at it from a personal perspective because My family has been in Florida for nearly 8 generations. This is my grandfather and myself on horseback when I was younger, and this is my great-grandfather in the summer of 1929 with my great-uncle. And he went on to be Florida's 25th governor back in 1929 to 1933. And it's a man I never knew but always admired because I heard about his interest in conservation. The man on the horse here, or the young boy on the horse, is my great-uncle. And I had the chance, when I was doing a magazine writing class at about your age, to spend a day with him on his cattle ranch in Hardee County in the town of Limestone, and hear about times when he would go for 3 days and 3 nights on horseback without ever seeing a fence. So to think about the scope of change in a single person's lifetime and his ethic of wanting to preserve that land, it really motivated me to want to tell his story. And thankfully, I still have a lot of first cousins who are still full-time cowboys in the state of Florida, like cousin Doyle III and his son Dale, who are out there every day getting on their horses and maintaining these lands. During my journey to photograph ranches, I made a discovery for myself, was that we had Florida black bears living almost entirely on cattle ranches in the central part of the state. So here I was, an 8th generation Floridian with a master's degree in ecology, and I had no idea that we had bears living on cattle ranches in the northern Everglades. So this became an emblem to me of this wild Florida that we wanted to showcase. I met a biologist, Joe Guthrie, doing amazing work. He was putting GPS collars on the bears' necks to figure out the way they moved across the landscape. And one particular bear that he collared got named M34, and this bear went on a 500-mile journey in the summer of 2010. If you look in the lower right, that's Lake Okeechobee, that's the liquid heart of the Everglades. The upper left is Interstate 4. And this bear traveled 105 miles from north to south and basically showed us that this green land is still connected. Also, when it got to Interstate 4, it turned around because presumably there was no place to cross that road to get to the 500,000 acres of the green swamp just 10 or 20 miles away. The reason that bear had trouble was this: it's that intense development that continues to sprawl and consume so much land. But the reason that bear could travel the 500 miles it traveled is because of this. It's that agricultural fabric that ties together our existing parks and preserves. This is a cattle ranch in the headwaters of Fish Eating Creek. This is also a cattle ranch that has some of the best original bay forest left in the state. This was a huge motivation for me. We talk about Florida in 2100. This was a projection for Florida in 2060. The red in this map shows us the developed footprint for a population of 16 million people in the year 2006, projecting what it would be by the year 2060. So we saw the presentation earlier about the sea level coming up, but we're also putting a lot of pressure on Florida potentially from the inside out. And you can see the implications. The Everglades and all this land we're fighting to protect could be cut off from its headwaters and cut off from the rest of the state and the rest of the country by development. But it doesn't have to be that way, and that's the beauty of our opportunity. We're in the driver's seat now. We need to choose our future. And this is a vision for an integrated network of green space through Florida. This goes back for 3 decades of people talking about wildlife corridors. Unfortunately, this conversation hasn't been widespread in the public, and that's where I got involved, was trying to tell this story. I got together with science colleagues, and we proposed a campaign called the Florida Wildlife Corridor, so we could talk about the needs and the opportunity to protect Florida's green infrastructure. And to make that idea a little bit more real, I set off on a 100-day, 1,000-mile journey from the Everglades to Georgia to show that you could do this. This was supported by my first National Geographic grant. And we set off for this epic adventure and showed that from not just the perspective of a bear, but from some motivated explorers, you could actually connect from the Everglades to Georgia following only green space. We did another expedition in 2015, and I've had the real opportunity to see how these places fit together, and I can tell you firsthand that we still have an intact corridor that we can protect. So in 2015, I got an assignment from National Geographic Travel to go to the Everglades and take a picture of Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. I decided to get out my camera traps, and I had some good success with a bear and a lot of frustration with a Florida panther. But this female Florida panther walking away from my camera, I don't know if she knew that she was going to influence the next 3 years of my life, because I've become obsessed with telling this story, because in the Florida panther, we have an emblem of this hidden wildness. It's there not far from any of us, and symbolizes the opportunity we have to help protect this corridor. There are approximately 200 panthers in Florida. It's the last puma east of the Mississippi River, and the only way they're going to recover to sustainable numbers is to expand the territory, and that means having access to terrain further north. This area in the orange is the known breeding range of the Florida panther as of 2 years ago. And you can see the Florida Wildlife Corridor and the opportunity to expand that population. Panthers face a lot of barriers, and vehicle mortality is one of the top. I just learned that the 27th panther this year was killed last week, and it was one that had been hit previously, rehabilitated, released, and it is now deceased. But there's also positive stories. These are two kittens whose mother was hit by a car, and they were all released together through veterinary care. But the biggest news for me came towards the very end, to the end of my first Panther grant. And this black and white picture is the first female panther to go north of that orange area that I showed in more than 40 years. Male panthers have been wandering throughout the state of Florida for a long time because they have bigger home ranges. But the first female going into the northern Everglades has brought in a new era of possibility for Florida panther recovery. And this is her. And this, at this point, was the most important picture of my career, because this is the first female panther known in my lifetime to be north of the southern Everglades. Then in January of this year, I captured this image. And there she is with kittens. And then in October of this year, I captured this photograph. And based on the patterns, I believe this to be the bigger of the two kittens from that previous image. So here we are at a moment in time where we have a chance to balance our growing population and the needs of wildlife with proper planning. The Florida panther is doing its part, and now it's up to us. Are we going to continue to consume nearly 20 acres an hour for development, doing things on our current trajectory? Or are we going to invest in the large-scale landscape conservation that can really fulfill these types of opportunities? This is a cattle ranch that's in the crosshairs of not just development, but also phosphate mining. But the landowner wants to find ways to help preserve this in perpetuity. It's about the rancher like Elton Langford, who's a 16th generation Floridian who wants to stay connected to his heritage. Because the path of the panther is about all of these things. It's about 1,000 swallowtail kites in this photo that need these trees on a ranch to fulfill their annual migration from Florida to South America and back. It's about these black bears that are living beneath those same cypress trees, and the swamps that fill with water every wet season and bring life for Everglades animals like this alligator. So I believe here in the story of the panther, we can help awaken a movement about what is needed for large landscape conservation for wildlife, but ultimately, in doing so, protect the water and the land that we need for ourselves. Thank you.
So thank you, Carlton, for that wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of our panelists for their incredibly motivating and inspiring work. So just to start off our conversation, could you maybe say a little bit more about why you think the Florida panther is an emblem of wildlife conservation overall?
That's a great question. I may have glossed over some of that before. They use so much land. A male panther, like the last one in my presentation, will have a home range of 200 square miles. I think that's 4 or 5 times the size of Miami. Big Cypress National Preserve is probably the only property under single ownership in the state of Florida that can provide the needs for a whole panther's home range. So in order to preserve panthers and to get to the numbers we have now and to go beyond that, it's going to be that network, that patchwork of all the different lands working together as one.
Terrific. Well, it's now my pleasure to invite the rest of our panelists up for a moderated conversation. We will not be taking questions from the audience. However, at the afternoon session, the meet and greet today at 4:30, you'll have the opportunity to meet all of our presenters today, one-on-one, be able to engage with them, and learn more directly about their work. So now, if I could please welcome the rest of our panelists to come join me on the stage. So I'm going to start off with a general question to all of you. And you all showed us the ways in which basically the history of Florida has been about the commercialization and commodification of our natural resources, whether that's water or land. So could you each say something about the work that you're doing in order to try to balance this increasing development pressure that we still continue to face, and then how we can look to your work as a vehicle for helping to create some kind of balance for sustainability? I'll start with you, Jenny.
Sure. I think for the aquifer, it's really hard because we can't see it. And so I think a lot of that is educating the next generation and also educating people about priority areas for where the aquifer is the most vulnerable, because there are certain areas that we could protect that would be really more strategic than others. So I think moving forward, education and working with our 5 water management districts and working with people who are interested in helping conserve water will be super important in making sure that we use the science to inform those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rachel?
Yeah, and I think, like you said, Jenny, one of the issues that we have on particularly our coral reef work and protection of Florida's corals, which have declined over 80% since the 1970s, is that people don't see them every day. So it's really hard to get your head around and to get people engaged in that issue versus, sometimes like marine debris issues, you see plastic everywhere, you want to take action on it. So I think one of the reasons why Geographic is so important and the beautiful storytelling and photography that's done is to bring these issues home for folks. One of the things that we're doing in order to try to achieve that balance is to try to promote the use of green infrastructure in order to combat sea level rise and storm surge and flooding. So that is reef protection, dune restoration, mangroves, things like that, and Everglades restoration as well, of course.
Great, thank you. Barrington?
Well, for us, we have a nonprofit called Experience Aviation, and one of the things we focus on is building skill set amongst young people. Right, so where will the talent come from to help to address these issues and the skill? So that's something we focused on, and we've had students build a number of different things, whether it's planes, cars, STEM devices, whatever the case may be. And the other challenge we have is getting directly in the classroom. So, when we go out and explore these different things, having that mechanism where classrooms across the nation can adopt this is also what we do through the flying classroom.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. And Carlton?
It's interesting because I'm seeing this theme of these stories not being visible to everybody, whether it's down under the aquifer or off in the coral reef, or in the case of these interior lands that, because Florida's so flat and we're not all up in an airplane, we can't appreciate them. So I really believe that we're at a moment in time in Florida where storytelling is going to be that tipping point, because we have an alignment of general public interest in the environment. We have landowners and stakeholders who are interested and dedicated to seeing these things forward, and we don't have the political will or the clarity of focus to achieve these things. And that's where National Geographic and the story can help elevate all this, and I see a lot of hope in that.
Terrific. So I want to address some questions to specific presenters about their work, and Rachel, I'll start with you. What do you see as the greatest challenges to Florida's water system now? Because you talked about so many challenges that we face. So what do you think is the greatest challenge that we're confronting now, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, so I think it is an interesting dichotomy always in Florida, because we have over-engineered and changed and developed so much of our our green spaces and water here in the state, but it also is still the backbone of our economy. And particularly here in Florida, we like to talk about our clean water economy, and the fact that people come here for our beaches, for our beautiful turquoise water, that our real estate economy is based around Biscayne Bay and having beautiful clean water, and agriculture as well. So I think it's incredibly important to make that connection for people too, that it's not always quantified in the way that we're looking at progress and development, but it's something that we really need to capture and protect. I think, of course, one of the greatest challenges that we're facing is sea level rise into the future. And it doesn't have an easy answer, it doesn't have an easy solution, but there are ways forward, there are ways to improve things, there are ways to get the scenario that's gonna have the most positive outcome for our community in the future. We just need, like you mentioned, the political will, the investment in those types of solutions.
Great, and Jenny, you also talk about kids interacting with water through your program, and you mentioned that there are a lot of takeaways that they view water in a new way as a result of their interaction with your work. So could you share a couple of those stories about how youth being engaged with water systems changes their overall perception about how ecosystems work, for example?
Sure. So when I first asked the kids what they thought was going to be there, or how the experience changed their perceptions of water, they would say things like, before I entered the water, I saw it just as a lifeless pool, but underwater there's so much more life there. Some of them were really enthralled with the turtle, and they kind of had some funny responses too, like, I love the turtle because it lives on its food. Not really sure, but in their mind you could tell, okay, these kids are seeing this place as something completely new. They thought it was just this random pool of water that kind of sprung up in the forest. For anyone who's been to a spring, it kind of is magical. There's this blue water that's appearing out of oftentimes a forest, or next to an agricultural field or something like that. And having that experience of being in the water and seeing these ecosystems and seeing the changes too. We talked about the increase in algae, and we talked about the grasses, we talked about the invasive hydrilla, and these kids really, even at 5th grade, had this incredible understanding of these ecosystems as really important places, and they expressed that very well in the qualitative questions I asked them. And one thing that photography specifically did, I was really interested in how having the camera in their hand and actually documenting these ecosystems would impact them. And it showed, what I found was that it helped them look more closely at things. So having the camera allowed them to really hone in on individual elements of the ecosystem and really get closer and see things from a new perspective. So a lot of the time in the water, I challenged them to look for these small fish called hog chokers that look like mini flounders. And I was like, if you stare really closely at the sand, you'll see that. So challenging them to really not get in and just splash around, but put a mask in their face and really see the ecosystem from a new perspective.
Terrific. And Carlton, you also talk about the power of photography and the ways in which we can better understand those wildlife corridors through photography. So how do you think your work has impacted people's understanding about what remains of our wildlife throughout the state?
Well, that's a hard question, because my answer is always not yet enough. I mean, it's the ultimate measure of success for a conservation photographer is tangible progress. Like, I'll be pleased when we can claim that a high percentage of that wildlife corridor is permanently protected. But I will say that it's elevated the conversation, and there's a lot more stakeholders and a lot more groups talking about this idea through the storytelling we've been able to do together.
Terrific. And so Barrington, I have a lot of questions for you. I know, I'm very intrigued by this aviation future for Florida, and I know you'll be leading the way. And you talked a great deal about the role of students and working with youth and really training them to be part of this new future of aviation and use of new technology. So what kind of advances are you seeing in the work that you're doing with students in terms of how we can imagine this very futuristic future for Florida?
Well, we have two key gaps, right? So at the K through 12 level, let's look at the state of Florida, since we're talking about Florida, right? 83% of math and science teachers don't have any professional backgrounds in those fields. So we need to do a better job as it relates to introducing students to what's out there and what's coming. The other tangible challenge is once students come out of, whether tech school or, university or whatever the case may be, once they get out, the true workforce skills that are needed is rapidly changing, right? So you go from working on sheet metal, and now you have airplanes built out of carbon fiber materials. So there's a big gap between what industry is actually doing and the knowledge level of participants. So we really try to expose students on the front end, and then on the back end, provide them tangible skills that they will use in the industry. I mean, we just have to, because that's why it's important to not only get the exposure out there through National Geographic and other efforts, but really provide the opportunity for them to do it.
Terrific. So I'm going to conclude by asking each of you to address what members of our audience can do, because we have very bright, engaged students. Gen Z is one of the most engaged generations that we have, and they're all very eager to participate and make a difference. And yet, as you said, Rachel, sea level rise can be really daunting. How do you address it? How do you confront it? So what do each of you think the young generation can do to really make a difference, both in terms of their personal practices, but overall in promoting sustainability? Jenny?
I think the most important thing, just from my work, is this idea of connection that I talked about in my presentation, because if we feel more connected to something, and if we can feel more connected to our water, it's going to be something that we prioritize protecting. So raising the next generation with this connection to water, giving them a voice in the story, which is really important, because if they feel like they're part of the story, they'll feel like what they do is impactful. That's why in the conservation behavior literature, one of the important things is people's feeling of efficacy. If they feel like what they do can make a difference, then they will act, and they're more likely to take that action. So making people feel like they're effective, part of the story, giving them a voice. And I think one of also the most important things we can do in the university setting for scientists, which I'll talk about a lot in the workshop tomorrow that I'm co-leading with Neil Ozen, is that scientists need to be trained to be better communicators. They don't have to be professionals at it, and we don't have to, all scientists don't have to, do it all the time, but it's an incredibly important part of science, and we need to do a better job of training scientists to communicate their work, because they all do have incredibly important stories to share.
Rachel?
Yeah, so I think my advice would be to follow your passion and to find the way that your particular skill set and your particular interests come together to make change in the world. And at Miami Waterkeeper, we do a lot of work here in Miami-Dade and Broward counties with the younger generation, as I mentioned, training them to be advocates and to speak out and to be community leaders. And we use an environmental lens to do that, but you could really apply that to any aspect of life. And I think, it can be a black box of how to get involved and where to start, but there's no magic sauce. It's actually pretty easy to go meet with your elected official or their staff, and we can help you if any of you are interested in doing that. Please feel free to reach out, find miamiwaterkeeper.org. You can become a member of the organization, follow us on social media. We post public comment meetings that you can come to and practice giving 2-minute public talks, writing letters, events, petitions, things like that. Our county commissioner, Daniela Levine-Cava, said that once a month you should write a letter, once a week you should make a call, and every day you should read about an issue that you care about. And if everybody did that, we would have a better world.
Great. Barrington?
I think for this generation, and you both have given some great points, to just simply add to that, I think one of the things this generation has to realize is thinking ahead. Sometimes when you're chasing from behind, it's difficult to make change, but when you know what's coming ahead and you can get involved with industry and help to pivot certain changes, that's important too. Knowing whatever field you're interested in pursuing or where industries are going, you saw different forecast models and maps. That knowledge is just as vital to convince people that, hey, these are real issues, and these are issues that's going to affect us in the next 5 years, 10 years, or whenever the case may be.
Thank you. And Carlton?
It's hard to add much to those thorough responses, but just kind of reiterating some of that, I would say engage in the political process, like Rachel was saying, and use your voices. I mean, do it through voting, but also the voices of youth, the voices of students and the young generation are some of the most powerful. When you saw the influence of at the Parkland tragedy not far from here, but use your voices and get engaged, and that's what's going to build this political will that we need to achieve this balanced future.
Well, please, once again, join me in thanking our panelists and enjoy the rest of your conference.